Okay, so welcome everybody. We're going to talk about how to generate and judge brilliant ideas. And I hope and assume that you've all received a PDF copy of the ideas book, which is where all these thoughts are taken from. And hopefully some of you may have had a suggestion that you actually first of all read chapter 2, which gives you a starter. Essentially the way the book is structured is that the first section is all about how to prepare properly for decent brainstorms and idea generation sessions. And then chapter 2, which some of you are hopefully would have had a quick look at, gives you 10 starter techniques for generating ideas. But what I'm going to do today is slightly more advanced stuff. And I'm going to talk about a few more techniques, 4 or 5, about how you can generate ideas effectively. And then we're going to get into the slightly more complicated area of how we understand, develop and judge ideas, because this whole creative area is something that we're living with all the time. So first of all, developing and understanding ideas. Let me give you a flavor for the kinds of points that I'm going to make. The main things I'm going to alert you to are, first of all, the mind works best when it's relaxed. Probably everybody has had that horrific experience of sitting at a desk with a blank piece of paper thinking, oh, what on earth can I come up with here? And it's a very difficult thing. But funnily enough, once you relax into it and get used to the way your mind can process idea generation, it's much better when you're relaxed and things will be better. So I'll give you a few thoughts on that. You can also increase your creativity by learning techniques. There are a large number of people who say, well, I'm not very creative actually, but really all the studies and the work suggests that that's not true. You can actually increase your productivity and creativity by learning some techniques, and there are plenty in the book. And linked to that is the idea that you shouldn't panic about being stumped, or in other words, not having an idea. So I'm going to give you a few thoughts on that as well. And then when we get to judging, we really need to be a lot more ruthless when editing out weaker ideas, because funnily enough, a lot of people can come up with a lot of ideas, but it's getting the best ones through properly done that is the most important thing. And finally, then we're going to give you some ideas about how you practice judging ideas so that it becomes natural, and I'll explain more about that when we get there. So let's start off with a nice technique, which I call 4-corner walkabout. Now, what we're illustrating here is 4 very large flip charts that you would ordinarily see in a room, and you get 4 of those and you stick one each in the corner of a room that you're going to walk about in with your colleagues when you're generating ideas. And what you do is you write a thought or a strategic idea or just one word in the middle of each chart, and each chart is going to have something different on it. So for the purposes of training, really simple example, if we were analysing something in the car market, then we might write 4 parameters, 1 in each of the pages. So for example, one sheet might say fuel economy, the other might say eco-friendliness, the other might say something to do with ergonomic styling, and the 4th might say brand image. And then let's say there's 10 of you in the room, give you all pens, and the first person goes up to one of the sheets and writes their first idea on there, and then they move on to the second sheet and add their idea, and so forth, going around the room. Next person comes along and they look at that and they either add a brand new idea or they build on the idea that the person before has written. Repeat, 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 repeat until the sheets are full, and suddenly then you've got a fast way of generating lots of ideas. And typically that's not going to take more than 5 or 10 minutes to whiz around the room. You then take the sheets, stick them on the wall, and you vote and work out what are the best ideas. And I can give you some thoughts later about exactly how you do that. Now, this is a really helpful technique. It's very inclusive and very fun, and a number of good things emerge from it. First of all, people genuinely are involved in teamwork here and creating something together. Secondly, it's very good for morale if you go back to the sheet of paper for the 2nd, 3rd, 4th time and see how other colleagues have built on something that you wrote down previously. And thirdly, it's extremely helpful when we're either using your cross-disciplinary teams in the agency, or even better, if you've got a client or media owner or other interested party in the room as well, because in that way they will have been co-authors of the ideas, and therefore they're much more likely to approve them, let you enact them, sign off the budget, or whatever it may be. In other words, make it a smoother run to execution. So that's a nice gentle start, which I call four-corner walkabout. Let's try another one here. This I call outliers. Now, one of the very interesting things generally in life is that humans are almost intent on finding and seeing patterns in things, and we do it all the time. We do it with data, we do it with people, we do it with phenomena, everything. And the interesting thing is that people often then say, aha, well, this is mainly what the market or the brand or the topic that I'm looking at does. And then if there's some sort of outlier or anomaly, they say, ignore that because that's just, it doesn't fit the pattern. It's often away somewhere. But interestingly, what I'm suggesting is that actually what goes on in some outlier away from the main drag is often of much more interest than the main theme. There's a guy called Nassim Taleb. He calls this place, metaphorical place, Extremistan. And so you may care when you're generating ideas to ignore the consensus view, head out to the edges and say, hang on, what's that thing going on out there? Because often there's something much more interesting there to create a more fertile idea for you. Then you're going to look at it and say, is there an interesting lateral link back to the brief here that gives me a better jumping off point rather than just the same old stuff that people are normally always doing? So that's outliers. The next one is something we call conceptual blending. And in essence, what this is doing is taking two things that appear to be utterly separate and from totally different domains, blending them together and making them come up with some sort of third and better solution. So the example given here is originally deodorant was something that you got from a spray can with an aerosol. And of course, it then became apparent that these are actually not friendly for the environment at all. So the structural challenge, if you like, is how can you deliver aerosol deodorant format in a different format? And it's an interesting little story that the person working on this actually was trying to crack the problem, and he had a biro on his desk, as many of us do. And it suddenly occurred to him that a biro strangely manages to convey a liquid from one place to another without leaking in its current form and applying it to a different surface in a new form successfully. And so essentially, he took the microscopic version of a biro delivery system, made it much bigger and turned it into a roll-on deodorant. It's exactly the same mechanism, it's just a lot bigger. So this is what a lot of people in innovation call recombination, because you take two things that already exist and then you combine them in a different way to get a different result for the specific thing that you're working on. Okay, so next up, this is something that's quite interesting. If you sort of know nothing about it or you know too much about it, it's a bit of an odd oblique technique, this, but nevertheless, let's give it a go. It's called strange or familiar. Now, there are two extremes on this one. You can either take something that you're very familiar with, or you can take something that you find very strange or you know nothing about. Now, so let's take the two of them. If you take something very strange that you don't know anything about, let's take a ludicrous example such as a jet airliner, and you would stare at that and think, right, what do I know about this thing? And you might surprise yourself, because you would actually have a basic working knowledge of how the engine works and how the wings work and aerodynamics and so forth. You might, you never know. Fuel consumption, airspeed, all that sort of thing. And then you can go and look for other things that you don't know and surprise yourself. So that's a form of being inquisitive. But at the other end of the technique, it's actually quite interesting to take something that you're very, very familiar with and stare at it and think, what don't I know about it? So, mad example, if I stare at an orange, I look at that and say, that's fine, I've eaten hundreds of oranges. How do they actually work? How do they come about? Why do they taste like that? Where does the citric acid come from? What does an orange seed look like? And so forth. Now, it's a slightly ludicrous example, but essentially, by looking at things in this different way, in other words, familiar things in a strange way, strange things in a familiar way, you're asking yourself, what do I know about it? What don't I know about it? So you're increasing your levels of inquisition. Right, so we're now moving on to how can you broadly make your attitude such that you're going to be more creative in the broadest sense, and you may have more of a chance of coming up with more and better ideas. So here's a concept we call training your depth mind. Now, depth mind is a phrase that we often use for what you might call your subconscious. And it's rather interesting to look at some of the phenomena that make a mind more inquisitive. So we want you to be constantly curious on the one hand, and almost be what I call a junk collector in your head. Now, I call that being a mental magpie. Magpies collect bright, shiny stuff, and they don't really know why. But at some point, they're thinking, that'll be useful. And in a similar way, anybody working in comms and similar industries should be mentally collecting interesting stimuli from the world around them, because at some point, it will make sure that your span of relevance is much bigger, and you're going to attach those stimuli to whatever the brief is that you're working on it when you're working on it. And this is something that we often refer to as practicing serendipity. And the interesting thing is that a lot of people will look at a creative person and say, oh, that was just a fluke, or that was luck that happened. But interestingly, it's not luck. Because if you open your mind up and prepare in that sort of way, then actually what appears to be chance favours the prepared mind. So it's almost like a way of life. And I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about your depth mind and how it really works. Now, so let's get to grips with this. Here is a funny little graph that has the moment of briefing on the left and time going along the right. And of course, what happens is that most people, when they get a new brief or are challenged to come up with something that's new and original, they think, right, okay, this is interesting, and they get stuck into it. But usually there's a kind of lull afterwards, or even a motivational dip, which means that you start optimistically and then you ping down here somewhere. And then you get into what we call the stumped phase. And you think, this is harder than I thought. So to reassure you, this essentially explains how the brain works, and it leads eventually to what is often called the unconcealing. And the way to do it is essentially to brief your depth mind, and after that, you focus on not being focused. And the way that works is the depth mind analogy, essentially, if you can imagine a submarine that sets off, it's going underwater and you can't see it heading towards its destination. However, it's definitely heading there. And at some point it'll surface. And in the same way, you can brief your depth mind and then focus on not being unfocused, go off and do something else. And so it's not a surprise, and you've heard it probably many times, that people say, oh, I had this amazing idea when I was doing X, in the shower, having a jog, walking the dog, doing something totally different. So if you're stumped and stuck, don't sit at your desk getting anxious. Instead, go off and do something else, confident that you have briefed yourself about the difficulty, the problem, and then it should surface later. If it's a really difficult thing and you really haven't achieved that, then you might care to rebrief yourself, possibly in the presence of someone else, try some colleagues and so forth. But broadly speaking, that principle works. Okay, now here's a nice thought. And it's all about not being pecked to death by ducks. Ridiculous phrase, but obviously you can get the idea. The principle of this is that a lot of ideas start off really well and they start off as brilliantly formulated things and they haven't been fiddled with yet. And then over time, and I'm sure people have had examples of this, the thing gets chipped away at. And that's what we call pecked to death by ducks. Now, it could be you, but probably not. It's more likely to be a colleague or a boss, or possibly a client. And you've got to trust your instinct and keep this thing intact and leave it alone. And in doing so, you can then look at that and say, right, how can I overcommit to making this thing do really well? And what am I going to have to sacrifice in order to stop it turning into a much poorer version of what it originally started out being? That's what we call pecked to death by ducks. I'm hearing some sound noise here, so can I just ask people to check that they're on mute? Thank you.
Thanks, Jacob.
Okay, so I'm going to finish up this session and then get us to a little chat with a couple of ways, because I mentioned that it's often the case that people are generating far too many ideas. Oddly enough, it sounds as though the challenge is hard when you've got to generate an idea. But the truth is that a lot of agencies are so fertile that they produce hundreds of the damn things. And actually the challenge isn't coming up with the ideas. The challenge is, how do we whittle them down into something much more manageable and much more robust? So I'm going to give you a couple of little techniques now, then we'll take a breather and I'll give you many more. So the first thing that I strongly recommend is post-it voting. So in other words, everybody in the room has got post-it pads, and as soon as the ideas are up on the wall, they can get to them and say, I like this, I don't like that, I like this, I don't like that, this has got potential, this one hasn't, and get that thing thrashed out. Now, if you leave that till the last minute, in other words, the end of a brainstorm or the day after, you're going to have way more trouble. It's going to be much more complicated than if you do it on the way. So I recommend that you triage these thoughts regularly during any ideas session. And it could be as frequently, let's say, as every 5 minutes. You might get 20 ideas up, cull, 20 ideas up, cull, keep going, keep going, keep going. And that way, it's not embarrassing, it doesn't cause major conflict. Occasionally somebody says, I want to keep voting for this idea because I still think it's excellent. But broadly speaking, you're going to get a lot of the crap out and away way, way earlier before people get wedded to them or can't even remember how they're supposed to develop. So then finally, in this first section, if it's extreme or if it's a very well-organized brainstorm and the stakes are really high, then I do suggest that you issue people with a number of kill it cards. Now this essentially means, let's say each participant has got 2 or 3 kill it cards, and you probably all sat in a brainstorm or an ideas session and thought, wow, this idea keeps coming back. It hasn't gone away. It's really not very good. I don't think it's going to work. Nobody said anything, and we're still talking about it an hour later, for example. And at this point, somebody needs permission and the mechanism to say, hang on, I don't think it's going to work. I'm going to play the kill it card. And often that will trigger an intense debate, and it should. But you can't spend your whole time wasting time, because it's much more important to concentrate on the ideas that are truly, truly worth developing. Okay, so that essentially concludes section 1. So I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment. And I'm going to pause the recording so that people can speak freely. And we'll take 5 or 10 minutes to do that, and then we'll repeat. Okay, so we're now going to get into some more detail about judging ideas, and I hope this will answer various questions you have. So the interesting thing about judging ideas is that they're all opinion-based. In other words, it isn't technically possible for one individual to say, that idea is brilliant, that idea is not. They can say that, but it's opinion-based. So something to give everybody confidence that is worth mentioning and repeating and reminding ourselves about is that marketing and comms advertising, and anything to do with ideas is essentially just opinion based. In other words, I think that's good, I think that's bad. And the interesting thing is that that is not a scientific way of judging anything, it's just judging it. And what tends to happen in comms is that people get more experienced, and or they get paid more, and or they have a posher title. And so the person who says that's good or that's bad just happens to be the person who's higher up the tree. But what we try to do, and what we want to do, is we cannot have a sort of hierarchical system in which that is permanently the case, because if that were the case, then nobody would learn how to develop these skills from a young age. So let me give you some examples of how you begin to thrash out whether something is good or not. So here, first of all, is something called the potential pyramid. It really is not complicated. You've got 3 strata on this: promising at the top, possible in the middle, and poor down at the bottom. Now, nobody's going to say this idea is poor when they originally put it forward or recommend it, but as you collect more and more, you realise, yeah, that's not nearly as good as that. So we're beginning to develop some sort of hierarchy, and we think, yeah, these ones are quite promising, these ones are possible, but the jury's out at the moment, and this stuff, no, that's our first cut point, if you like, of getting rid of this lot. And it makes your life a lot more simple if you remove the rubbish stuff early, and then you can really focus on the good stuff. So that's, if you like, way of doing it number 1. Let's assume we're going to take this lot from below the poor line, we're going to get rid of it and move on and try and improve what we do have. So here's a different way of looking at it, which can be a step on, which we call the decision wedge. Now let's assume that we've got rid of the first round of poor stuff, but we really want to work out, is this worth proceeding with? Because it's difficult and it's subjective, as we've discussed already. It's opinion based, but of course the more you look at this stuff, the better you get at it. Now, so you probably know that, for example, if there's an international football team, you've got 22 people in the squad, and in training, the manager will often play the probable team against the possibles, learning about how the dynamics work between the two. This is what we think are the better ideas, but we've still got some that maybe have some merit. So the first step is to divide them into those 2 types of group, and then really scrutinise what's going on here in the possible section to say, well, is it really possible? A lot of the things in the possibles will actually turn out to be impossible and therefore should be rejected. But some will migrate through and into, yeah, that will probably work, this box here. From there, you can analyse those with tighter criteria to see whether they merit moving through into the yes, we'll proceed with this type of category. So let's look at how we can look at that in a really, really practical way. Now, you can't get simpler than this. 3 criteria on a triangle. One says on brief, the other says enactable, the other says viable. I'm going to guide you through these. Now, let's do on brief first. Now, half the time, the client doesn't write a brief, people don't write a brief, and it's sort of taken as a given as it goes along. But let's assume a brief has been written down, and it's clearly articulated, and it's cogent and logical, and it works, and everybody knows what they're doing. But the interesting thing is that in comms, frequently, all this diligent work goes on to create something that really is a very cogent and excellent brief. And then strangely, the creative process takes over. And there may be quite a long passage of time as well between when the brief was written and when the creative idea emerges. And it could be weeks, in some cases it could be months. And there's plenty of ability for the idea to be well off brief by then. But the interesting thing is that often people don't even point that out. They don't even notice it, they don't cross-refer. So it's paramount that when you're looking at an idea, you immediately link it back and say, is this on brief? And if the idea is not on brief, then sadly it's got to be rejected. no matter how lovely and original it is. And this is something that gets confusing for agencies because they think that originality means that it's creative, and it's not necessarily true, which I'll explain in a minute. So it's got to be on brief. The next thing is enactable. Can it practically be done? Regardless of whether it's good, bad or ugly, can it be done? And this, we're talking about practical measures here. And of course, we all know, particularly if we look at industries like PR and so forth, there are so many factors that could be out of your control that it's quite possible that a number of ideas simply are not enactable. And if that's the case, then sadly they need to be rejected because they're not going to get done. And then finally, and this is not the same as enactable, not really, it's viable. We're talking commercially here. Is this thing actually viable? Is it worth doing? Let's give a crass example. The media budget to go on TV is £500,000. The cost of making this idea into a TV commercial is £400,000. Oh dear, this isn't going to work because it eats up too much of the budget and it's not going to generate a suitable return on investment. Therefore, it's not viable. Simple example, and we've got lots of people tuned in today from lots of different disciplines, so you'll be able to transfer that to your particular discipline. But if it doesn't fit all three of these, unfortunately, it's not going to work. So up here, unlike the Meatloaf song, 2 out of 3 ain't bad, I'm afraid you need all three of these criteria. As an amusing aside, one of my friends told me the other day, by the way, that the Japanese translation of 2 out of 3 ain't bad is 66% is good enough, which is not quite the same thing and is not true of this particular idea. So now I'm going to move on to a thing called the originality pane. And this essentially takes two simple criteria here. It's either good or it's bad, and it's either original or it's not. In other words, it's derivative from somewhere else. Now, two of these quartiles are easy to work out. If something is really good and really original, then great news. Use it to progress and inspire more of those. That's not complicated. Bottom left-hand corner, if something's bad and it's derivative, then get rid of it straight away. It's clearly not going to do the job. But where things get interesting here is in the top left and the bottom right panel. So now, first of all, if something is really, really good, but actually it's rather derivative and a bit samey, well, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. I know that people are always looking for originality, but let's have a look at this and say, okay, it's good, but it's a bit samey. Can we analyze the advantages and disadvantages of being derivative in here? And is it going to do us much harm, or actually is it, broadly speaking, not a bad thing to do? And if the answer is, we're happy with that, then you may find that it's acceptable to be here. But the one that is most complicated and difficult to grapple with is being bottom right, which is being original and bad. Now, if you think about it, there's almost a trick, a mental trick, whereby people say, well, if that's original, that's got to be really good. But it's a non sequitur, because actually things that are original can also be bad. It stands to reason. And the problem is that they're much more appealing to people, particularly in comms, because every time a client says, can you give me a media first? Can you break new ground with this? Can you do a paradigm shift, or whatever language they use? They're asking for something that's original. And because it's original, it's intrinsically risky because we don't know what it's going to achieve. So this is a very tricky area to be in. But broadly speaking, if something's original and actually it's bad, you've got to analyze why and then find intelligent ways to course correct and generate new ideas, because this is a very dangerous place to be. Okay. Right, I'm going to give you some constructs now just to help you work out whether ideas are going to work. And this is partly related to a question that was asked earlier. How do you defend an idea, present it, explain it, and so forth? So let's have a look at some details here. This is the idea relevance map, and you'll have seen many of these before. Market maps. It's the simplest diagram in the world. It's 2 lines, it's a grid. It creates 4 quadrants. So for the sake of argument here, in order to judge creative and ideas, I've chosen here margin. Will it generate an excellent margin for the product or will it not? And here, does it have excellent customer appeal or does it not? Now, it doesn't matter how many ideas you've got really, because you can do as many grids like this as you wish. But what we're trying to do is plot each idea on here somewhere and say, right, how viable or what great margin will that generate? High, low. How relevant is it to customer appeal? I've just chosen these two criteria, but you can choose many, many others. And we plot where the ideas sit in relation to these points. Now, clearly, in this instance, and you always want to head top right, to a maximum point of relevance where this thing is going to generate an excellent return on investment and it's going to have tremendous customer appeal. Therefore, it's going to be highly fertile and extremely good thing to pursue. Okay, so that's a way of mapping out your ideas, and you can do it as many times as you like with as many ideas as you like. Now, here's another way of looking at that. We call it the idea bravery scale. And this is really based on a really, really simple question. And the question should be asked before you start generating the ideas, if you possibly can. And the question is, how brave would you like these ideas to be? And it seems like an odd question, but it isn't. And on this particular thing, we've said 0 out of 10 is dull as anything, very safe, and 10 out of 10 is very brave. So it's just a way of calibrating how brave would you like this to be. Now, if you can ask the client, for example, who's asking you for this thing, what degree of bravery they want first, then immediately you've set up a type of language which enables you to judge and assess creative ideas later on in the process when you present the work. Now, it's interesting here because, of course, some brands and companies are intrinsically more adventurous or more conservative than others. So, for example, banks might generally go for a 5, 6, 7 out of 10 campaign, whereas modern tech companies might go much higher, up to 10 out of 10. You can also aim one thing off against another, for example, by asking a client, can you give us some examples of a 9 out of 10 campaign? And you might find that what they give 9 out of 10, you would only give a 6 out of 10, and suddenly you've got a new scoring system and a way of calibrating the work. And then when you present back, if you've been fortunate enough to have the time and resource, you might say, we've got 3 proposals for you. One's conservative, one's in the middle, and one's really adventurous. The adventurous one doubtless will cost more, but do you want to go for it? So that's the idea bravery scale. Related to this is something we often use in negotiation skills, and this is the chance of success axis. And really, this is trying to challenge the idea as though you were a client or as though you were a customer. And essentially what one's doing is saying, right, what are all the reasons why either the client will reject this idea or the customer will think that it's a lousy one? And you work out what these barriers are between them saying, yeah, I like that, or I don't. Of course, your client can block the idea, which is bad news for you, but the customer could see it and say, I don't like it, I'm not going to take any action as a result. Now, this looks a little bit pessimistic, but it isn't actually, because what happens is that in thinking through what these barriers are, you do your own piece of analysis and critique of the idea and work out, actually, I've just realised there's about 5 or 6 reasons why the customer won't go for this. It's a bad idea, we need a better one. Or I've just worked out there's several ideas, there are several reasons why the client won't go for this. However, we think we can persuade them, and by highlighting this and marshalling the evidence to support each point, we may be able to break these metaphorical barriers down and get them to say yes to our proposal. So thinking through those things makes you tougher on the idea. It also makes you much more cogent when you're selling your proposal to the client. Got a few more constructs here, and then we'll have a chat as well. So this is what we call the central idea satellite system. And it looks really easy, but it's a bit deceptively difficult when you get to a certain point, which I will explain. So what you do is you take your central idea and you write it here in the middle on the main planet. And then what you're doing is producing satellite sub-ideas, which could be executional or developmental or complementary or something that is all linked to the central theme. And it's usually pretty easy to say, right, this is my central idea, and here's one executional example of it, and here's another. But where life gets interesting is where you're trying to look for your third, fourth, fifth iteration of what this thing is. And often what happens is you rattle off 1 and 2 pretty easily. When you get down to about 3, you think, I can't think of another one. Or the one I'm thinking of is actually pretty similar to the one that I've just done. And what you find then is that actually the central idea is not as fertile and productive and good as you thought it was. And this is a very crucial pressure test, particularly for people working in comms. Because if you allow yourself to get carried away with this central idea, saying, yeah, it's marvelous, it's brilliant, look at this, look at this, look at this. If you haven't pressure tested it, you may find that it's found wanting either when you're presenting it to the client, when they cross-examine you, or when you come to do several executions of it and think, we haven't got as much fuel in the tank as we thought we had. So I strongly recommend that you do this exercise internally or with respected colleagues before subjecting the idea to the client and then possibly overclaiming that it's rather marvellous and very fertile when in fact, under scrutiny, it isn't. So that's the central idea satellite system. Let me give you another version of that now called the 3 buckets. Now you may have seen this before. It can be used in many, many different situations, but I'm going to apply it here in a creative context. And here we've got 3 buckets, and one is brilliant basics, the other is compelling difference, the other is changing the game. I'll quickly explain what they are. Brilliant basics is not very exciting. It's what they sometimes call excellence as standard, but actually you or the brand should be doing these things normally, just as part of basic delivery, if you like. I don't like calling this stuff business as usual, BAU, because it sounds a bit derogatory, whereas brilliant basics sounds a bit more enthusiastic. Anyway, an idea could be dropped into the brilliant basics bucket. And it doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it's relatively straightforward and functional. Compelling difference, you're looking at that thinking, this has got a lot more merit than the other stuff. It's significantly better than normal. And these ideas are demonstrably better. So there's good value to be had there, much better. And then finally, on the right, changing the game. No one's done this before. It's definitely going to work. It's genuinely remarkable. It's a unique perspective on this issue and so forth. Now, we don't know how many ideas we've got, but clearly if you've generated 100 in a brainstorm, it's a really helpful sifting process to say to everybody, right, would you put it there, there, or there? And if you end up out of 100 ideas with, let's say, 1 or 2 or 3 that are in the changing the game bucket, then you should get rid of all the others. It may be a bit painful, but the other 97 need to go because that's really good. If you've got something in compelling difference, that might be good too, even if you haven't got a change in the game. But one way or another, in most cases, if at all possible, and in the interests of higher quality all the time, all the brilliant basic stuff in a creative idea sense should not be implemented because they're probably not good enough. There may be 1 or 2 examples, but probably not good enough. Okay, so that's the 3 buckets. So I'm going to give you one final perspective now, and then we'll have a little discussion. And this is something I call the pre-mortem. It's not my idea. It comes from a brainy guy called Gary Klein. Now, you've all heard of a post-mortem where unfortunately somebody dies and pathologists are trying to work out what happened there then. But this is called a pre-mortem. And what it does is it asks the team to analyze forensically the thing that is just about to be financially approved. Okay, so this is a final check to judge whether the idea is sufficiently worthy to proceed with. And bear in mind that often when this decision moment arrives, it's a very pricey one. Could be £1 million campaign, could be £10 million campaign, could be absolutely huge. Anyway, large amounts of money are just about to be committed to this thing. And the procedure is really quite simple. It's actually quite fun as well. So when an organization, let's say your client, has almost come to an important decision but not formally committed itself yet, then you get the decision makers together for a brief session. And what you do is you ask them to imagine that it's a year later, or 3 months, or 6 months, whatever the suitable time span is for the project that you're discussing. And you get them to imagine that the idea has been a complete disaster. It's all gone horribly wrong. And they have to write down a short history of what's happened. In other words, the main factors that meant that the whole thing went really, really badly. Now, again, this seems a little bit pessimistic, but actually it isn't. It's incredibly powerful, because you need to flush out those things and make sure that they have been said and observed and understood before we commit huge amounts of money. So if it's done properly, a pre-mortem can prevent many a disaster, whereas a post-mortem, of course, is by definition potentially useless. You could just about argue that a well-informed post-mortem could allow you to do the next campaign better, but it doesn't alter the fact that you've completely wasted the resources on the one that you've just done. So in summary, with a pre-mortem, you say, we haven't started yet. Make sure you do not leave this too late, because the later you leave it, it's too late. And people are emotionally invested and they may have been started investing money. You imagine it's finished. You imagine it was a total disaster. You work out what went wrong. And if something emerges there that you think, yeah, actually that is a serious deficiency, we need to reconsider, then you've got to reconsider. So those are a series of thoughts about discussing and judging ideas. Just by way of a quick end frame bonanza for you here. The ideas book where these thoughts come from is out in many other different languages. There are 10 of them here. So if anybody here speaks these different languages, you can go and find them there. Some of these are beautifully produced. For backup resources on the whole topic, theideasbook.net is the blog, and there are all sorts of templates, frameworks, videos, and other things lurking on there. And if people like the style of these books, we have a whole series of them out, and there they all are, which I won't bore you with, but there are lots of short, fast ways of gaining lots of ideas, and a lot of these topics we are training regularly. So thank you for listening. I'm going to stop sharing and stop recording, and then we'll see what questions we have to sweep up.
Okay, so we've got a couple of questions.